Hello everybody and welcome to BookTube's most prestigious book awards, the Michael Knipp Channel BookTube Awards that I just came up with this year. I have a whole host of categories, which is just an excuse mostly for me to talk about my favorite and least favorite book moments of the year, but unfortunately, because of the virus, none of the authors are here today to accept their awards. Nonetheless, they should all be expecting them in the mail shortly, and by that I mean they may get lost in the mail. It happens a lot these days. But with no further ado, let's get to the categories. The category we are starting with first is going to be a real Debbie Downer because I only want to go up from the beginning. The category that I will announce first is Most Disappointing Book of 2020. Drumroll, please. And the winner / loser is To Sleep in a Sea of Stars by Christopher Paolini. That wasn't a surprise to anyone, I think, if they've been watching my channel this year very much, because To Sleep in a Sea of Stars was like one of my most anticipated books of the year, and it was one of my least favorite reads, period. I think that book is not very good. I have a review that is quite negative, and in the time since I've made that review, I've only grown more negative. To Sleep in a Sea of Stars was not great. I think the humor didn't work. I think the writing was way too extraneous. I think the characters were mostly not interesting, or I didn't care about them. I think the main character was awful. I think there's an entire section of that story that could be cut off and axed because it's not good. It detracts from everything. There's a red herring. I think that Christopher Paolini put in placeholder names for every single item in that book, place in that book, species in that book, and I think that the ending is so far out of left field and so far into nowhere land that I just can't positively say very much about it at all. So unfortunately for you, Christopher Paolini, I've enjoyed a lot of your works in the past, but this most recent book that you've published was a very hard disappointment for me. I still am interested in checking out what comes up next in the Fractalverse, but my expectations will be heavily tempered. And I'm curious if the expectation of Chris's publisher might also be heavily tempered, because I think that book mostly sold based on name. It wasn't a good book. I'm honestly surprised how it made it to the point that it did. But let's move on. The next category is a wonderful category, which is what book has my favorite prose? Prose is not something that I was particularly invested in. It's not something I really understood. I hadn't read enough books recently to actually decide whether there was a prose style that I enjoyed or didn't enjoy very much. But this is the year that changed, because when I picked up Assassin's Apprentice, oh frick, I messed it all up. Hold on. And the winner of Best Prose in 2020, according to Michael Knipp, is Robin Hobb. Megan! When I picked up Assassin's Apprentice and it starts off with that like first-person narration of what's like the history of the world or whatever, I didn't know what was going on in the story, but I knew that I absolutely loved reading the story being told to me, even if I wasn't invested yet. Because Robin Hobb / Megan Lindholm is able to tell stories using words that I want to listen to what she has to say, because the way she says it is so beautiful. She's the one that really got me into prose this year. And because she's able to do it in my favorite genre, which is fantasy, and she's able to do it while getting me attached to such wonderful characters as those contained in the Farseer trilogy, dang, it has to go to Robin Hobb. This is probably also not a surprise to people that have been watching my channel, but I have to say it again. I need to read more of your books because I love to read your words on your pages. The next category is funniest book. What is the funniest book that I read this year? This one is a toughie because different books are funny in different ways. One of the books on my list is Anxious People, my first Frederick Bachman book. This book has some superintended hilarity. Even though I don't think its primary goal is humor, it's very funny. It contains a lot of great elements that are very Looney Tunes, and not Looney Tunesy, it's not slapstick, but loony, silly, very silly moments. I threw Eclipse as a nominee on here because the things that happen in Eclipse and Breaking Dawn are both funny, but I don't think they were intentional. Kings of the Wild has some great, awesome humor moments. And also I put Dawnshard on this list because the Lopen in Dawnshard it's next level. I love the Lopen in Dawnshard. Before in his books, I enjoyed him. I thought he was funny, but he really steps up his game in Dawnshard to being just hilarious, frankly. But the award for funniest book out of the books I just named is going to go to Anxious People by Frederick Bachman. It's the story where a bank robbery happens, and then there's a hostage situation, and then the police are interviewing the people in the hostage situation, and the things that happened in that room where everyone was being held hostage with the bank robber. It's wild. Is it realistic? No, but it makes it makes for a beautiful book. There's a lot of heartfelt story moments that are able to happen because of that story and the way that Bachman writes it. Bachman was also a heavy contender for favorite prose, but I really only read one of his books this year. I'm going to give funniest book to Anxious People. Now, the next category I am calling most emotion, and the two books that I'm going to highlight in this category are Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb, which is my favorite book in the Farseer trilogy, and it's also one of my favorite reads this year. It's going to be mentioned again at my favorite book of the year moments. And the way that Robin Hobb is able to meld different people's motivations and different real feeling characters into the same story where everyone has different goals, but they're all working towards the same greater goal, but they sometimes have harsh disagreements on the specifics on what to do. And also she just really likes to beat Fitz down, as well as anyone associated with Fitz really just has a rough time. Royal Assassin is a book that I felt the whole book, but there are moments in the book, especially later on, that just, they hit me so hard. Royal Assassin is an amazing book. But the other book that I'm going to mention on this list is Sword of Kaigen. Now, Sword of Kaigen is a book that I have a review for here on the channel. It starts off kind of slow. It's a Japanese-inspired fantasy about this family that lives in this place called the Sword of Kaigen. They're supposed to be the front line of defense for the Kaiganese Empire, but the family drama that unfolds, the story that's told within those pages broke me. I full on had a moment where I had to put the book down, or I was just, I couldn't handle it. It was too much for me to handle at one point. Also, there's other moments where I was just pumping my fist hard because I absolutely loved what was going on. It was handled in a way that I never expected, didn't know I wanted. It was better than I expected it ever could be. So yeah, I don't know if you figured it out, but I'm going to give the most emotion category to Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wong. I want to read anything else she writes because this book was amazing. The next category is favorite world. Of all of the worlds in all of the fantasy books that I read this year, which fantasy world would I most want to live in? This doesn't mean coolest world, it means like what would be the one that I want to live in. And this is going to be a book from a reread for me. The winner is The Chronicles of Narnia. Narnia is a place that ever since I first discovered it as a child, I've wanted to go to Narnia. It's a world where bad things exist, but there's so much magic and whimsy and so many other things that are happening outside of just absolute tragedy and ruin for a significant period of time. In fact, the times that we see Narnia are the main conflicting times of Narnia. I want to go there. I want to see the talking animals. I want to see the fairy tale creatures, the naiads, the dryads, the fauns, not the minotaurs, they're bad, but you know what I'm saying. I want to talk to all these creatures. I want to be in Narnia. It's a lifelong dream of mine. Heck, if you include the magician's nephew, there's even more crazy things that could go down. The Chronicles of Narnia is my favorite world of 2020. Now we're going to talk about the worst world that I read about in 2020. The first book I'll mention in this category is Mistborn. The world in Mistborn Era 1, which is what I'm referring to, absolutely sucks. There's ash falling from the sky. There's a guy named the Lord Ruler who is leading all of these people and letting slavery run rampant, and there's this awful class system. Women are abused openly and frequently. The world of Mistborn absolutely sucks. The story of Mistborn is good, like I said, but dang, I do not want to live there. The next book I'll mention in this category is The Memory Police. Now, this was not a book that I loved, and honestly, I don't know how to interpret this book, but The Memory Police is a world where there's a group called the Memory Police who steals items from your memory until, spoilers, but things start disappearing and they're gone forever. You can kind of figure out where it goes, probably. The world is nebulous enough that this probably should win, but I'm going to not have it be the winner. But the winner of the worst world category for me is going to be Rage of Dragons. 2020 is another year where I don't know exactly what grimdark is, but what I do know is Rage of Dragons is the darkest, suckiest, most complicated, grayest morality absolute awful butt world to live in of all of the books that I've read in 2020. It's absolutely grimdark in my book. The classism that exists, the like insane revelations of who the different factions in this world are, their parts that they've played in the global economy that now exists, the struggles that the main character has to go through because there is not any real good system of justice at all in this world, the darkness that's being hidden from the regular people. Rage of Dragons is a sucky world. I loved that book, but I do not want to live in that world, and that's why Evan Winters wins the award for Worst World of 2020. I don't want to be there. We're gonna bounce back to a negative category, and the last category was kind of negative, but I wasn't bashing. I was just saying they did a really good job of making a world I didn't want to live in. The next category is biggest nope of 2020. I wanted this to be kind of vague, but I also wanted to use this opportunity to talk about a book I don't think I've talked about on the channel yet. I'm a member of the Book of the Month Club. I'm not sponsored or anything, but one of the months that existed was this book called Leave the World Behind, which was, I think, advertised as a thriller, and it seemed interesting. It was like about a family that goes on vacation and the power goes out and they have to figure out how to deal with it, something like that. But Leave the World Behind is the most, I'm going to use a word that's not very nice, the most pretentious, unreadable prose I've ever seen in my entire life.
Their gray car was a bell jar, a microclimate, air conditioning, the funk of adolescence, sweat, feet, sebum.
I was listening to the audiobook for this one, and there were times when I had to rewind it and be like, is that really what someone wrote on the page? What the actual crap am I reading?
The car was Clay's domain, and he was lax enough that it accrued. The talus of oats from granola bars bought in bulk, the unexplained tube sock, a subscription insert from the New Yorker, a twisted tissue ossified with snot, that wisp of white plastic peeled from the back of a Band-Aid, who knew when. Kids were always needing a Band-Aid, pink skin splitting like summer fruit.
Not only was the prose the most self-indulgent prose I've ever seen, but it was painting this story. I couldn't. I have never noped a book so hard. Other books I've DNF'd this year, like The Cruel Prince, it was like, yeah, it's not for me. There's some really stuff in here that doesn't vibe with me. I could make fun of it a little more, but I'm not going to right now. But Leave the World Behind, it was atrocious for me. I was like, there's no way. If I finish this book, it's going to be the craziest, angriest rant review I've ever had, because I hate everything about what's going on in this book, and I hate the act of reading it maybe more. The next category goes to favorite male character, which I had a really hard time picking because I loved a lot of the stories that I read this year, but because the Stormlight Archive is like one of my favorite series and I read that this year, I'm gonna go ahead and say Kaladin Stormblessed is my favorite male character that I read about in 2020. I know that's not a very hot take, it's not a very bold choice. Other potential candidates included choices like Dalinar Kholin or Fitzchivalry Farseer from the Farseer trilogy. I guess technically I could have included Edward Cullen and Jacob Black on this list, but I'm going to give it to Kaladin. I'm going to take the easy route out on this category. Next category is favorite female character that I read about in 2020, and this one was not even a close competition. There was no other options. It's Misaki from The Sword of Kaigen. Misaki, the mother in Sword of Kaigen, is my favorite female fantasy character probably of all time that I've read. She is so well realized, so deep in character. She goes on such a journey over her life, which we get to experience through this book, and she comes out on the other end, and it's just beautiful. At the beginning of the book, I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about her, but by the end of the book, there was no question. I think it's going to be extremely hard to beat Misaki. I'm trying not to spoil things here, but she is the most cool character on multiple levels that I've read this year in the female spectrum. Holy crap. Okay, editing Michael real quick has to point out that I did one character dirty because I talked so much about Misaki, and Misaki is awesome, but I didn't mention how flipping amazing Ketcherkin is from the Farseer trilogy. I can't go into much detail because of spoilers, but Ketcherkin is a beautiful, wonderful character, and also definitely does compete, I think, with Misaki for awesome female characters I read this year. The next category I'm talking about here today is favorite book cover, and I read a lot of books with awesome covers, but my favorite cover of all the books that I read this year was To Sleep in a Sea of Stars. That cover is beautiful. I'm going to show you the digital version, but heck, have you seen that thing in real life? It's shiny and pretty and bumpy, and it has that, it's just such a cool graphic. The cover is an additional reason why I was so hyped for this book. I think To Sleep in a Sea of Stars is my favorite cover of 2020 of all the books that I read. On the flip side, what was my least favorite cover of all of the books that I read this year? I'm going to give it to Mistborn: The Final Empire, the first book in the Mistborn series. I hate so many of the Mistborn covers, but the one I see the most, the one that shows up when I select this book, I have it in e-copy, so the cover is relative. But I think the worst one is the purple one. It looks like the first time I ever saw this book, I had no idea what it was, and I was turned off completely. Listen, here's a hot take. We all judge books by their cover. I don't know why everyone feels like they have to admit that tentatively, like it's a bad thing. We all judge books by our cover. We have to want to pick them up to read the synopsis at some point. So we look at the cover. That's why covers are there. That's what they're for. The cover for Mistborn, I never would have picked that book up in a million years if it was this cover that I'm showing behind me right now. I think it's an awful cover. I don't want to blame the artist because I'm sure that they were told to draw something, and I'm sure that that's what they did, but it is not a cover that appeals to me at all. And frankly, except for the limited edition anniversary cover, I don't like any of the covers for the first book. I like some of the covers for the other books in the series, but not the first one. The next category is favorite author. Who was my favorite author in 2020? This one's gonna be an easy one. I don't feel like arguing it too much. I could say Robin Hobb, but I didn't read very many Robin Hobb books this year. That's gonna be a real hot category next year. My favorite author, I'm gonna be default, if that's a thing that you can say on BookTube. It's Brandon Sanderson. I read so much of the Cosmere this year. He gave me so many wonderful storytelling experiences. He also gave me the Stormlight Archive, as well as Mistborn, Elantris, Warbreaker, Skyward. Loved all these books. I'm not going to delve into that too much because I've talked about this on the channel already. I think he's a wonderful storyteller. I think his prose does not get in the way for me like it does for some people. My favorite author of 2020 was Brandon Sanderson. And the final category, the number one book, my favorite book that I read in 2020. This one was an extremely hard one for me. I've already talked about Royal Assassin. I've already talked about The Sword of Kaigen. If you've seen my tier list, you might already know the answer, but I'm going to have to choose The Way of Kings as my favorite book that I read in 2020. Does that mean that I don't like the other Stormlight Archive books as much? No, it means that I don't like picking books out of a series individually because I see series as a whole. And people always ask me to list books in a list instead of just saying, oh, I love the Stormlight Archives, it's my favorite. So if I have to pick one, I frequently pick the first one because that's usually the one that introduces me to everything. It makes me fall in love with the world and the characters, and The Way of Kings did that for me, along with having an epic ending, beautiful mystery that kept me gripped throughout. I love The Way of Kings so much, but I had the blessing of being able to read the entire Stormlight Archive this year. I count them all as one, so don't just think that I don't like the other books. I love Words of Radiance, I love Oathbringer, and frick yeah, I love Rhythm of War. It's a killer book. Rhythm of War might be my second favorite in this series, but I love the Stormlight Archive so much. I've gushed about The Way of Kings, but if you have seen this channel, you've probably seen that review. It's my most viewed video. I love The Way of Kings so much. It's still my favorite book. That is because the Stormlight Archive is still my favorite series, at least. So yes, my favorite read of 2020 was The Way of Kings / the Stormlight Archive. Thank you so much to everyone who has followed my BookTube journey in 2020. It has been an amazing year for me, BookTube-wise and reading-wise, and while everything else in a lot of the world is just falling apart in so many ways, this was a respite for me, and I hope that I was able to provide some entertainment or some kind of service to you by talking about different books. I hope that the people that were able to read books on my recommendations liked them or loved them preferably. I hope that I brought a smile or a laugh to y'all's faces. I am so looking forward to reading more books with you in 2021. You guys have been such a blessing to me by interacting with me on this channel and interacting with me on the Discord. There's a link to the Discord down below. Thank you to everybody that is there and talks with me every day. Thank you all of you who recommend books to me that I can then read on this channel and gush about. Books like The Sword of Kaigen and Royal Assassin were books that I was planning on getting to eventually, but because of so many recommendations and such high praise, I ended up reading this year, and I freaking loved them, obviously. So thank you everyone that's been involved in making this experience wonderful for me. If you'd like to see more videos from me and you haven't subscribed to this channel, please hit the subscribe button. I would love to see you on the channel next year, but I can't tell you what to do because I'm not your dad, but I am your best friend. Bye. Should odd acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind? Should odd acquaintance be forgot and days of odd lang syne?